Okay. So, hi everyone. Welcome to the BCS Journal Club event. Me and Avisha will be the hosts today. So today we have with us Erin Grant. She's a PhD candidate in ECS department UC Berkeley, which is affiliated with the Berkeley Artificial Intelligence Research Lab at UC Berkeley and the Computational Cognitive Science Lab at Princeton University. She has also been a research intern on the Google Brain team and on OpenAI team. She received her bachelor's from University of Toronto. Her research interests lie in the understanding of prior knowledge in human and machine learning using the lens of meta-learning. So welcome Erin to BCS in our journal club. So, okay, I believe the format of the talk will be, we can ask questions to you after the talk is ended.
Yeah, I'd also be happy to take questions during the talk.
Okay.
I feel that, like, if it's a journal club and you normally have discussions, it would be nice if, like, you feel free to also interrupt me so that we can discuss things during the talk. And on top of that, I don't know how familiar you are with specifically my domain of research. So there may be things that I'm assuming as prior knowledge on the part of your journal club members. And so I'm happy to field any questions that are related to content, but also just hypothetical questions.
Okay, sure. That will be great. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Great. So we'll figure out how to share a particular screen of mine. Host disabled attendee screen sharing. So I think in order to be able to see my slides, somebody, whoever the host is, needs to enable that.
Okay. Avisha, could you enable?
Yeah, okay, now it's enabled.
By the way, is the sound all right?
Yeah, this is perfect.
Great. Awesome. Okay. So should be able to see my screen.
Yeah.
So this is obviously not my qualifying exam. Okay. So thanks a lot for inviting me. As I said, I welcome any questions during the talk, especially if you have questions about the content that I could explain better. Also have some backup slides that might help explain things. But to give an overarching view of what I'm going to talk about is a particular way in which we can relate the study of human and machine learning, especially given the recent advances in machine learning that use things like deep neural networks. Okay. So so I'll start by contrasting human and machine learning. So although humans and machine learning systems are often tasked with similar problems to solve, the constraints under which they operate are quite different. So machine learning systems require increasing amounts of data and compute to solve more and more complex problems. In contrast, people are able to make sharp inferences given very little data, sometimes even with only a single example from a concept or a single interaction with the new domain. People are also able to, say, adapt their learning given computational constraints. So in particular, humans' cognitive capabilities are physically bounded by a physical substrate, the brain, and so they have to be used efficiently. And lastly, people don't have access to multiple lifetimes of experience. So humans make decisions without seeing millions of training examples or hours of gameplay, unlike the methods that are in the plot on the left, which are usually trained with that amount of experience in order to achieve human-like or surpass human performance. So while this contrast between human and machine learning is quite stark, and it will become more so if the trend of increasing compute continues, So this, as it stands, is a bit of an ill-posed comparison because humans benefit from innate biases provided by evolution that constrain their learning and thereby increase its efficiency. So as a consequence, the real comparison we should be making is to the machines on the left that are trained from scratch with millions of hours of experience of gameplay, for example, and the entire evolutionary history of humans, as well as the learning that they may experience during their lifetime. So what is a way to get around the idea that we may have to simulate all of evolution in order to make better comparisons between humans and machines? Well, one line of research that's particularly productive here is a line of research that investigates exactly what are the biases in humans that are bestowed by evolution. So the inductive bias of human learning, in order to test that particular inductive bias and to test its utility in machine learning systems. So this sort of application-based study is very complementary to important questions in cognitive science that try to uncover exactly the content of core knowledge in humans that constrains their generalization. So this is a focus on inductive bias, both in machine learning and human learning. And to make this focus, this focus has a potential to provide interdisciplinary insights in cognitive science and machine learning. Okay. So I'll give some examples of known biases in human learning in order to quantify exactly what I mean when I say inductive bias. So cognitive scientists have already done the work of enumerating many of these things, many of these biases that have a role in learning in infants, children, and adults. So while I won't go into explicit detail on each of these, some that are relevant to the design of machine learning systems are things like object-orientedness. So the bias that objects exist and that they move independently as wholes on connected paths. This is from the work of Spelke. Another one is the theory of mind, that there are agents in the environment that act in a goal-directed way separate from the central agent. There's also things like numerosity, so the fact that there are relative and absolute numerical magnitudes and that basic arithmetic is a thing that you can do. And lastly, one that's received a lot of interest in recent years due to the interest in neural language models is our word learning biases. So these are biases that constrain how learners acquire new vocabulary, and these are things that impose the bias, like new word labels denote taxonomic structure, so they depict object kinds rather than specific properties of an object. Okay, so a cognitive scientist might ask of these biases, so which of these are inductive biases in human learning? So are they bestowed by evolution and innates? And a machine learning scientist might ask, like, which of these inductive biases are practically useful in machine learning systems? And if they might be practically useful, how do we implement them? So in order to go a bit more into detail into why inductive biases in machine learning are interesting to study, from a machine learning perspective, the trend has been seemingly in favor of minimizing inductive bias. So you take a machine learning system, you minimize sort of prior knowledge or featureization or constraints, and then you exploit huge over-parameterized models and general purpose learning algorithms such as stochastic gradient descent. You train it on a lot of data. So while these models fit in the way that is like accurate on the training data, these models still produce undesired generalizations. So the conversation has shifted a bit from questions of like underfitting, so how can we fix machine learning so that we can actually fit the training set, to questions of data set bias. So how is bias in large-scale data sets picked up by high variance models, such as neural networks? So even for these systems, though, inductive bias still plays a role if we relax the definition to include data-dependent inductive bias. So for many downstream application tasks, and with a fixed dataset budget, initializing a model in a data-dependent way, so maybe partitioning the dataset, pre-training on a subset of that data, and then subsequently fine-tuning that model on a downstream task. This often outperforms data-agnostic initialization. So such setups are particularly useful when the downstream task might not provide a large amount of training data, which is common in things like medical applications and making a diagnosis from retinal photographs. So that would be like having a source task on which you initialize your model and then fine-tuning it on a target task that may have a limited amount of data. So along this line of inquiry, the first central component of what I'm going to talk about is centered around gaining a better understanding of a certain technique for data-driven learning termed meta-learning, and using this understanding in the design of machine learning systems that acquire data-driven inductive bias. And since another central component of this talk is centered around gaining a better understanding of inductive biases in humans, I'll also discuss an example of inductive bias that is very well studied by psychologists, and one that I mentioned before. So this is a bias in word learning called the shape bias. So this refers to the presence, when given, say, a single example of a new category label, to prefer the shape match, so something that has the same shape, over a match along other salient dimensions, such as color or taxonomic relationship. So by the age of about 24 months, English-speaking children exhibit this shape bias. And then several other studies have provided strong evidence that this bias is learned rather than innate by designing an experiment in which children acquire a shape bias prior to its natural emergence. So additionally, there's some cross-linguistic evidence that infants with mother tongues other than English manifest less of a shape bias due to the difference in how objects are partitioned into object categories. So this strongly suggests that the shape bias is an example of a learned bias in that it affects the learning of new categories. So from the perspective of wanting to understand human cognition, it would be nice to understand how it is that biases in learning are actually acquired and not innately bestowed by evolution. So how exactly can we formalize the acquisition of this sort of bias? So I'll give a brief roadmap of what I'm going to talk about if I get to it. So I'll focus on some of the work that I've done so far, which is based on understanding and building on meta-learning and machine learning, and also on using meta-learning as a modeling paradigm in cognitive science. So this is a somewhat interdisciplinary part of the talk. And then I'll also talk a bit about things that I'm looking at moving forward. So these are things like enriching cognitive modeling of inductive bias. So now that I've made this connection between meta-learning in machine learning and cognitive modeling of inductive bias, it's possible to leverage some of the insights, the recent insights and improvements in machine learning models in order to better understand human cognition. And secondly, in order to understand exactly what we're assuming in these cognitive models that make use of updated machine learning tools, it's important to also sort of scrutinize the existing inductive biases in machine learning models that are not quite as well quantified as in prior iterations of machine learning, in which it was very easy to identify what exactly you're building into a system. And these ongoing research ideas are somewhat complementary to the two pillars of research that I've done so far, in that they are potentially more applicable to either machine learning or cognitive science. Okay, so first I'll focus on understanding and building on meta-learning in machine learning. So, by the way, are there any questions from Journal Club members so far? I'm happy to talk about anything.
Hey, yeah. Hi. I did not quite understand the inductive bias. I do know that these are assumptions that you make from a machine learning point of view. These are the assumptions that you make when you use an algorithm, but from a cognitive science perspective, the example that you took of the shape bias is something very different. So could you elaborate a little bit more on what exactly you mean by inductive bias?
Yeah, of course. So the best way in which to maybe understand how we can kind kind of directly translate between inductive biases in machine learning and inductive biases in cognitive science is by looking at things through a hypothesis-based framing of learning. So what a learner does, whether they're a human or a machine learner, is they receive some data, and with that data, they select a hypothesis amongst some like space of hypotheses that basically denotes, say, a prediction function that they're going to use in order to make predictions on that data. Right. So when you frame it this way, an inductive bias is nothing but something that constrains the space of hypotheses, so that for one, it's ideally smaller. So when the learner is trying to select a hypothesis amongst this set, it's less computationally intractable in order to be able to do so. So it makes the learning problem easier, and it also omits from consideration some hypotheses that conflict with the desired inductive bias. So like in the case of the shape bias, it might mean that the learner omits from consideration any hypotheses about labeling new shapes that relates to the color of the object. So if I'm learning about new words, I'm always going to prefer, I'm never going to consider a labeling that uses information about the color of the object. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and so to relate that a bit to how that would look in machine learning, this just means that you have in your search procedure, so whether it's like optimization, gradient descent, or a simpler kind of search procedure like random search, it just means that this candidate set of hypotheses is smaller in some way. And the some way is a way that's like defined by the inductive bias. So from a computational perspective, it's desirable to impose this thing because then it means that we have a less of a hard problem when we're trying to actually fit these machine learning models, because there are fewer candidates to consider. Yeah, so that's how I think about things. And then meta-learning is sort of the acquisition of inductive biases that constrain the hypothesis space. So you can kind of think of it as the acquisition or the parametrization of such a set of constraints. But yeah, maybe when I go through a bit this example of, or this formulation of meta-learning, and also look at an example, it might be a bit clearer. But feel free to interrupt me if it's not. Okay, so normally when we have was there another question?
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Actually, I wanted to know, you mentioned that in machine learning models, there is some sort of bias that is associated with the data as well. So can you give some examples of where we would see that?
Yeah, exactly. Of course. So we can kind of partition the space of inductive biases into things that are assumed. So this might be what most people mean when they call it prior knowledge. So it's just a constraint on the hypothesis space that's not a function of data whatsoever. So it's, in the shape bias example, like perhaps independent of, a hypothesis could be that independent of any of the data that children have seen, they always have this predisposition to associate word labels, sort of like shape relations, and they never consider anything like a color bias. So that this would be something that's like innate in the child when it's born and doesn't change as a function of data that the child perceives. And so this in machine learning would be similar to like having a classifier with some specific featurization. So say you have a specific kernel function that takes the input data and featurizes it in some way. And then learning is just learning a classifier on top of those features. So we would say that if the kernel is something that's not data dependent, it's just specified a priori, this is an inductive bias that is also not data driven. Now, there's like, since machine learning systems have become so complicated, in some cases, it's not exactly clear what is a data-driven inductive bias and what is a just what is prior knowledge. So something that I think we can consider a data-driven inductive bias is any, so if you have a, say, initialization function for your neural network weights, and you use like the mean and standard deviation of your data set in order to initialize those weights, that's a data-driven inductive bias, because you're actually taking the data set, you're using it to compute some statistics, and then you're subsequently using those in order to set the initialization of your machine learning model, which has an effect on the classifier that you eventually learn. And a more complicated version of data-driven inductive bias is meta-learning. So you define a loss function that basically lets you acquire an initialization or a learning algorithm for a learner that you could subsequently apply to a different learner in order to speed up the learning of that separate learner. So does that distinction make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no worries. Right. So along the lines of what I just said, meta-learning can be seen as a data-driven inductive bias. And how exactly does it differ from just like standard learning, where we have a machine learning model, we apply it to some data like the images that I've pictured here, and then we have a learning algorithm that somehow sets the parameters of that learner, or that model. Say the parameters are phi. So if learning is estimating these parameters phi of a model by applying this learning algorithm A, then meta-learning is nothing but estimating the parameters theta of a parameterized learning algorithm. So the parameters theta, which again are the parameters of the learning algorithm, not of the model, are tuned to produce good behavior of a base model by applying the learning algorithm A theta to a data set within the meta-training set. So I have a bunch of these separate training sets, and I have a learning algorithm that takes in some parameters. When I apply that parameterized learning algorithm to a bunch of models, and then subsequently observe their downstream performance, basically we tune the parameters of this learning algorithm such that the downstream performance of the models that it trained is better. And so you can kind of wrap this into a gradient-based optimization procedure as long as you have some way to evaluate exactly how well the parameterized learning algorithm can train models that are applied to one of a set of candidate data sets. And we can similarly, like we have in machine learning, we can similarly set up our meta-training set, which is a set of data sets on which we're learning the parameters of the parameterized learning algorithm, and we have a meta-evaluation set on which we freeze the parameters theta of the parameterized learning algorithm, and then use it to train a bunch of models and evaluate their performance. And this would be called meta-evaluation. So it's sort of like embedding learning in a way that you can learn the parameters of algorithms that are applied to separate learning problems. Does this formulation make sense to everybody?
Hello.
Yeah.
So
hi.
Just one question. So meta-learning, does it have any sort of relation with neural architecture? So it sounds.
Yeah. So I kind of phrased it a bit like abstractly here. I haven't told you exactly what the form of the parameterized learning algorithm is. I haven't said exactly how it applies to the model. So you could kind of see neural architecture search as a parameterized learning algorithm. So it's usually like an RNN that outputs, say, tokens that correspond to like the sequence of construction steps of a neural network. So you could frame that as meta-learning by saying my algorithm A theta is exactly that RNN with its parameters theta that produces the architecture of a neural network that's subsequently trained. It's subsequently trained usually using a generic optimization algorithm, but at least some portion of the initialization procedure of this model involves some parameterized meta model that operates over a whole set of models.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions about this framing of meta learning?
Hi. So I was wondering, will in meta learning we would probably need much more training examples to learn on, right? Because we're going one order higher.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So you can kind of think of it as you need a lot of tasks. So you need a lot of data sets on which you train models. But interestingly, for each of those data sets, they can actually have fewer examples. So you can actually have a setup in which the number of tasks grows as you, say, grow the size of your parameterized meta learning algorithm. But then for each of those tasks, they can have few data points. So it's just a question of exactly how heavily you parameterize your model. But in general, yes, you can think of it as, if I want to train a giant image classifier, say resonant 50, and I want to train it with a learning algorithm which itself has parameters, so it's probably going to also be a very complicated thing. The total amount of data, so the sum of data points across all of the data sets, is probably going to be pretty large. But my intuition tells me that it's not going to be many orders larger than a generic learning problem, just because of these, like, you have an extra degree of freedom, which is the number of data sets, and you can just increase that degree of freedom and not necessarily have to increase the number of examples in each data set. But this is not very well understood. We just know that few-shot learning works. So few-shot learning is a setting of, for each data set, you only get a few examples and you need to solve a problem. That works pretty well, which suggests that you just really need to increase the number of data sets in order to get this to work.
Okay, thanks. And another question, are we trying to learn maximize the efficiency of the learning algorithm, or are we also modifying the architecture itself? I mean, through meta learning.
Yeah, so like the previous question, I explained how you could view neural architecture search as a version of meta learning in which the meta learner is just the thing that produces the architecture. And then I mentioned that you subsequently may apply a generic optimization algorithm. So you could actually do something more complicated here, such as having a neural architecture search method that produces an architecture, and then also having a parameterized learning algorithm. And you may be learning those things jointly. So you have the architecture component, and you also have the optimizer component that you parameterize. And those parameters are learned by looking at the performance of the models that they construct and then subsequently train. So there's like a lot of freedom here in terms of setting up the learning problem.
Okay, thanks.
No worries. Any other questions on meta learning or and how it relates to learning? Okay, so I'll give an example of a few-shot learning problem, which, as I mentioned before, is the scenario in which you are solving a meta learning. You're optimizing a meta learner. So you have a parameterized learning algorithm that trains a bunch of models on different data sets. So in this setup, we can actually, across all of the data sets, we may be able to deal with the fact that each of those data sets doesn't have a lot of examples that sort of delineate a classification boundary. And in that case, it's actually the bias of the meta-learning algorithm. So the sort of summarized information across all of the data sets that allows it to only required to train on a few examples. So the setup might look something like this. We have a bunch of training data sets that basically ask for a solution of a binary classification problem, such as in the first case, distinguishing a cat from a bird. And for each of those classes, cats and birds, we only get, say, 4 examples. And then we get a query item, which is a single example, and we're supposed to label it with either being a cat or a bird. So if you tried to train a generic image classifier on exactly this training set where you have 4 examples and 1 query example, it wouldn't be able to do very well, just because it doesn't have enough data in order to be able to successfully distinguish these 2 classes. Like, you wouldn't be able to tune the visual features of this classifier so that it's able to make this classification decision correctly. But if you actually get the meta-learning algorithm to initialize this class, and then subsequently fine-tune it on each of these separate classification tasks, it's actually able to perform very well. And this is quite surprising and also useful for applications. So we have a downstream test data set. We want to solve the task of distinguishing dogs from otters. And we've potentially never seen a dog or an otter before. We can do it by using the solution from meta-learning that initializes the model. The prior knowledge from the training data sets and uses it to basically initializes that model and then subsequently fine-tunes on the small amount of data from the test data set, having never seen these novel classes before. Any questions on the few-shot learning setup? Okay, so yeah, I think this is quite a cool application and lets us do things like we can potentially learn how to transfer from robotic manipulation from simulation to reality. So like we basically learn, estimate parameters of a meta-learning algorithm that is able to take a model that was trained in simulation with a lot of data and then just fine tune it with a very small amount of data in the real world. And so that unburdens say robotics researchers from having to train a robotic arm only in the real world, which is potentially very costly, and the robot might break down and stuff. So there are a lot of cool applications for this type of setup. So the reason we're here is we're interested in cognitive science and not necessarily machine learning. So I described a few of the applications of meta-learning and machine learning. And now I'll talk a bit about exactly how this helps us to understand human cognition a little better. So I'll recall this example of the shape bias in word learning. So this is, again, the preference when given a single example of a new category, like this yellow apple, to prefer a shape match, so the red apple, over a match along other salient dimensions, such as color or taxonomic structure, like this yellow banana. And so to think of this correctly, you should kind of think of this as a child having never seen an apple before, and it gets a single example of this yellow apple, and then it subsequently asks, what other items in the world would also classify as belonging to the same category to which I've applied this label, the same category as this yellow apple, which I've just labeled for you. So first I'll present a formalism in cognitive science that models the acquisition of a shape bias in category learning. So basically, we discussed before how the shape bias is something that's not innate to humans. It's actually acquired over the course of their learning. But how exactly do you learn something so abstract, such that having never seen an example of this class before, knowing that the red apple is a member of this category and the other items are not? So you can probably guess, but it looks something like meta-learning. So the researchers who first formalized the acquisition of the shape bias use something called a hierarchical Bayesian model. So without going into too many details at the moment on the computations required by this model, because that's a little beyond the scope of detail that we're interested in. So this model was able to produce the acquisition of the shape bias. So we're seeing basically acquire the bias for when learning new categories that he preferred the shape match. So the idea is that you have some lower level parameters phi, which parameterize a belief over the specific shape for example, round, that characterizes a new category. And then you also have some higher level parameters, theta, that parameterize the belief over the degree to which shape is homogeneous within a category. So if you set the higher level parameter theta in a particular way, it would tell you that categories all share the same shape, or categories differ in the degree to which shape is homogeneous within that category. So this is kind of like a higher order belief that describes the homogeneity of shapes across categories, and doesn't describe for a particular category sort of like what are the applicable shapes within that category, such as round. So in this formulation, acquiring a specific setting of these parameters theta is equivalent to learning whether or not a shape bias exists in category learning, because the shape distribution for any new category depends on the value of this theta. So this model is able to reproduce this shape bias effects on a psychological category learning task for known categories, but more importantly for our case, for novel categories. So the children never having seen objects of this kind before. And this is when they experience a sample of constructed English object categories. So as a consequence, we can see it as a way of using machine learning, specifically hierarchical probabilistic modeling, in order to understand how inductive biases may be acquired in humans by simultaneously learning at multiple levels of abstraction. And on the converse, it's also a way of implementing the human-like ability to acquire biases that constrain future learning, perhaps making it more efficient because they have to consider fewer hypotheses. So there's a drawback to these kinds of hierarchical shape bias acquisition. So they're very restricted in complexity, and inference and prediction in these models are quite hard. So prior to some of recent years, these sorts of models were restricted to very simple stimuli and don't really capture the sort of naturalistic interactions that people may have when they're acquiring or making use of their inductive biases. So this leads us to the question of how do we sort of update these hierarchical probabilistic models in order to use modern machine learning methods. So the main idea here is that meta-learning is nothing but learning inductive bias from data. So it's data-driven inductive bias, as I've argued before. And in Bayesian hierarchical modeling, on the other hand, I showed you that the inductive bias are the higher order parameters. So in particular, the parameters of a prior distribution. And so this means that we can make an analogy between these two sort of different ways of learning inductive bias from data by basically framing meta-learning as learning the parameters of a prior distribution in the same way that Bayesian hierarchical modeling does. So concretely, we can basically go back to the recipe of looking at how a learning algorithm transitions into being a meta-learning algorithm by looking specifically at what are the inputs to this model and what are the outputs of this meta-learning algorithm. So again, we have some data sets. So say we have these 2D points in a plane on the right, and these data sets comprise one class blue and a second class red. We have a learning algorithm A, that basically takes this data set and produces a decision boundary in the case of classification. So it might look something like this linear decision boundary. And then we take these parameters that have been estimated on the data, and we subsequently use that model to make predictions on a held-out set of data. And then we subsequently evaluate those predictions. So in a similar way as before, we can encapsulate this learning problem and then basically add an extra parameterization of the learning algorithm A, such that we tune these parameters of the learning algorithm theta, encapsulate the distinct learning problems into a loop so that we're able to update these parameters theta of a learning algorithm based on the downstream performance of each of the models that are trained on each of the data sets. So this computation graph looks like a little like this. So theta goes to phi, which makes predictions about y given x. And theta are the parameters, again, of the learning algorithm. So we can change this into a probabilistic meta-learning algorithm in order to make a better analogy between modern machine learning methods for meta-learning and hierarchical probabilistic models, which are used in cognitive science, by essentially replacing this computational graph with a probabilistic model and subsequently changing the some of the objectives and loss functions in this meta-learning algorithm so that they're formulated as probabilistic inference problems instead of just machine learning optimization problems. And this allows us to basically say that meta-learning algorithms which follow this specific form of maximizing the log likelihood of loss functions like this, of probabilistic models like this, are actually doing probabilistic meta-learning. So they're exactly the type of hierarchical probabilistic models that people have used in cognitive science. And this adds a few computational complexities, but some of the work that I've done is on basically identifying that you can avoid a lot of these computational complexities by recasting some existing meta-learning algorithms as probabilist point estimation in these sorts of probabilistic models. So does this recipe make sense to everybody? Or do people have questions on exactly how the learning proceeds?
So the parameters phi and theta, is phi inferred from theta?
Yes. So basically, theta here acts as a prior. I don't know if you can see my cursor, unfortunately. Theta here acts as a prior on phi. So if you see this term in the row of estimate parameters, p phi given theta, this is basically a that is conditional on theta that basically produces a belief over parameters phi, agnostic of data. So this is even before you see data, you have some inductive bias that dictates how likely certain settings of phi are. And how likely they are is dictated by the belief over settings of theta, or in the case of a point estimate, the point estimate of theta. But
and so,
yeah, go ahead.
So the learning rule of phi and theta are different, right? So it would require two different algorithms, two different networks?
Not necessarily. So what I'm describing here is more of the generic probabilistic model, and exactly how you parameterize these probabilities is sort of a lower level modeling choice. So as long as you have a model, it could be a neural network that produces a likelihood value for p of y given x and phi, and a likelihood value of for p of phi given theta, that is a consistent probabilistic model. And it doesn't, this doesn't prescribe exactly how to set up those models. You could also basically maintain full posterior probabilities, which doesn't require you to really hold on to any parameters at all. But this is not something that people usually do because posterior inference for like generic full distributions is quite difficult. So that may not like fully answer your question, but basically the way that you can think about this is not prescribing exactly how to set up neural networks that parameterize these probabilities, but basically just saying that as long as they're consistent with this formulation, then it is a valid probabilistic model.
Hi, I have a question. common problem with hierarchical models is that you see shrinkage parameters, right? So
Yeah.
how do you take care of shrinkage here? Because shrinkage will limit the number of problems you can generalize these parameters. I mean, you can these parameters. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
So that's an interesting point that you bring up. So like shrinkage in hierarchical linear models is basically the idea that like across a bunch of populations, or like the statistics of a bunch of populations will inform, basically constrain the higher level. So you may experience, or you may like observe a particularly biased, in a sense, estimate of the high level parameter. And I guess it really depends on how different you think a population that you want to generalize to is from the training data on which you've estimated your shrinkage coefficients. Because in cases where the test population is sufficiently similar to the training population, this may not actually be problematic. And it could help you, in fact, generalize to the test population, especially if the test population doesn't have a lot of data. Now, if we sort of estimate an inductive bias that is too constrained and not flexible enough, this could actually hurt us in cases that the test population is sufficiently different. So this doesn't really get around the issue in trying to generalize to something that is not supported by your training distribution. It just means that the meta-learning just allows you to basically construct a lot of data sets. So basically fill the support of data sets or populations in the hopes that your test data set or your test population lies within that support. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So basically, you still have limitations, right? So I mean, it's not
Yeah.
really generalizable. Yeah. Okay. And I have one last question regarding a couple of slides back. You talked about shape, the work on shapes, right? So how was shape really quantified in that model? I think it was a 2007 paper, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't quite remember the details of this paper, but
because
it was a very
sorry. I was saying quantifying shape in a psychologically relevant way is still an open question within cognitive science.
Yeah. So like these simple models rely on maybe a categorical representation of shape. So not even like a continuous representation of how round an object is, but like potentially whether or not the object is round or not. So while it did capture this like interesting idea of acquiring an inductive bias for shape, it's not really, as you said, like psychologically relevant because it doesn't capture potentially many of the features that people are using in order to inform their word learning. And it's probably an open question as to like what exactly are the features of the world that people use in order to like, inform their category delineations when they're learning about new words. But yeah, so like I think we can still do science when there are open questions about what exactly we should be doing. But it's definitely clear that this model is way too simple. It doesn't really depend on any visual features, just a symbolic representation of shape.
I see. Thanks. Yeah.
No worries. Any other questions? So I basically described how to translate existing meta-learning algorithms into probabilistic hierarchical models. So we can kind of translate a lot of the insights from cognitive science models into modern systems and potentially be able to use things like convolutional neural networks in order to construct visual features that are a lot more naturalistic than the symbolic features that were used in prior models. So I don't want to go too long, so maybe I'll skip a lot of the stuff that, a lot of my work that looked at alleviating some of the computational intractabilities using a probabilistic meta-learning algorithm with complicated models. And I'll basically try to conclude conclude and show a few applications of using this perspective of understanding meta-learning as hierarchical probabilistic modeling. So first, by summing up, I'd like to basically convey to you that I think that this perspective of understanding meta-learning algorithms like MAML in terms of hierarchical Bayes allows us to get a unified understanding of meta-learning algorithms. So understanding them as probabilistic inference or point estimation in these models. And we can potentially use inspiration from the probabilistic inference toolbox instead of constructing sort of ad hoc meta-learning algorithms that are not well justified. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, we can use these connections to probabilistic models in order to connect these meta-learning algorithms with cognitive models of inductive bias learning and potentially do more interesting things like using cognitive models to inspire AI and also using AI in order to study human cognition. Okay, so I'll briefly show some applications of this connection. So a lot of the existing hierarchical probabilistic models had this very simple structure in which there's a singular parameter or singular distribution over theta that informs the acquisition of, say, new category labels. So the probabilistic model looks like this, and the computational graph looks like this, and I've shown you how you can make an equivalence between inference in this probabilistic model and meta-learning algorithms that have this computational graph structure. The thing is, as cognitive scientists, we know that there are a lot more interesting things going on when people learn in new situations. So, for example, there's some work that shows that when people are learning to, say, count the number of circles in a new array, they actually use auxiliary features in this array, such as color, spontaneously to inform the generalizations that make, as long as something like color is correlated with the number of circles. So they're using some structure about the task in order to inform the generalizations. And we can capture this by introducing auxiliary latent variables in this probabilistic model that basically correspond to theories about what sort of structure humans are learning when they're solving a new task like this one. And so we've done this, and we've been able to basically use a latent variable model in order to have a machine learning model that is able to adapt to a non-stationary task distribution. And so the idea here is that you have a latent variable which corresponds to the inference about what task you're in or what environment you're in. And if you're able to continuously make inferences about which environment you're in, you will be able to basically adapt a parametric model like a neural network discrete tasks. And this is a common problem that happens when you have a non-stationary task distribution, and you might want to adapt quickly to the fact that you may observe a change, say, from viewing images that were taken during the daytime to viewing images that were taken during nighttime. So this is an example of how you can use this formulation of meta-learning as probabilistic models in order to basically construct better cognitively inspired machine learning methods. And then another way in which we've investigated this idea is looking at observable context when dealing with learning in new situations. So in this case, you can kind of view this case as learning a language from two speakers who speak different languages. So you may observe the same objects, but depending on the speaker, it implies a different mapping of the object. So say that the duck to the word. So in the case that I'm observing the first voice speaking, I would know that I'm going to use this particular mapping, this particular rule set. And then in the case of the second voice, I'm going to switch to a completely different one. So this is basically a similar model of the latent variable being unobserved. You posit it observed, and you basically allow it to bias the estimation of the task-specific parameters theta. And we've also used this in a setting called goal-conditioned reinforcement learning, which is basically the setting in which you have a policy controlling a robot arm, and you provide it with the goal location. So it has to condition on this observable information, which is similar to the voice, and then subsequently navigate to that specific goal position. So this is quite a complicated problem, because if you just have a robot arm set in an environment and it doesn't know what the goal is, it won't achieve high reward at the end of training. But if you explicitly provide it with some auxiliary information, then it's able to perform much better. Yeah, so those are two examples of applications of this connection between meta learning and hierarchical Bayes. And I think I'm going to end there, because I've gone about, I think, 50 minutes. And I'll open the floor to questions and discussions. Like, it's Sunday, so I can stay for a bit if anybody would like to chat.
Hey, so that was a great talk. I have two questions which are sort of unrelated. The first being, you spoke briefly about few-shot learning and how meta learning can sort of help with few-shot learning and enable few-shot learning. But don't you think the overarching goal of few-shot learning essentially is to bring artificial intelligence closer to human intelligence, because humans are able to learn from lesser data points? But when we use the kind of algorithms that you describe, or the idea that you describe, we're still going to need a larger amount of data to learn the parameters. And then if we use those parameters in a different setting, we'd need, less examples, less training data. But if you look at the sum total of the data that we use, we're still going to require a large amount of data. So that doesn't really solve the problem of few-shot learning, or does it?
Yeah. I think your concern is valid depending on how you look at things. So if you look at, say you want to have a machine learning system that requires less data in total, this is not really going to address that. It really becomes useful when you have a substantially different test environment and you want to be able to have a model that is pre-trained using some meta learning algorithm, and then subsequently apply that model to this different test environment and adapt to it quickly. So in that case, this could be an application like I mentioned before, like say you're meta learning an algorithm that can very quickly transfer policies learned in simulation to the real world. If you have a test environment, in that case, you may be able to get away with a very small amount of real world data in that test environment. And so it's more of lessening the data demands on the downstream task than it is lessening the overall data demands. And another sort of point that I mentioned in the beginning of the talk was the ill-posed comparison between looking at a machine learning method that's trained with hours and hours of gameplay or millions of images, and comparing that to like a human child, which you can quantify exactly how many hours of experience a human child has had given a certain age. So that's a bit ill-posed because you're training the machine learning algorithm from scratch. The child was born with some innate knowledge. That means that it doesn't require so much data. So really the appropriate comparison is comparing a machine learning model to a baby plus all of evolution. So in that way, it's in both cases a lot of data.
Right. And speaking of using the parameters that we've learned in one environment in a different on a different task, it's sort of related to transfer learning, where you can essentially transfer stuff from one environment to another. To what extent do you think, I mean, this is a very broad question, but to what extent do you think this sort of transfer learning can work, and does it have any constraints on when it would work and when it wouldn't? Right, yeah. So transfer learning is algorithmically a little different because it doesn't explicitly optimize the parameters of an algorithm based on how well those algorithms are able to train models. But in a way, it is producing some pre-trained initialization that you can then take and apply to a downstream task. So I would say that at a certain level of
abstraction, transfer learning and meta learning are quite similar in that they give you basically this initialization so that you can take this initialization and learning algorithm and apply it to a downstream task, and get away with a small amount of data on that downstream task. I think the kind of benefit of meta learning comes into explicitly constructing loss functions that optimize directly for the efficiency of training a model. So transfer learning doesn't explicitly do this. It just happens to be the case that when we take pre-trained parameters and apply them to a downstream visual task, that they work fairly well. This is kind of not really well understood, but in meta learning, since we're explicitly optimizing for the performance of training of a model after it's been trained using the meta learning algorithm, you can do things like get better theoretical guarantees because the loss function is optimizing exactly the thing you care about, and potentially practically optimizing that loss function is going to give you better performance than simply like taking a pre-trained model and applying it at test time.
Right, okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. Any other questions?
I want to ask that, does meta learning has any sort of promise towards generalization?
I think in a sense, it's not going to get you away from problems of like the problem of empirical risk minimization. So you're going to be optimizing your model on your training data set. And if your test data set is substantially different from your training data set, so it's like not in the support of your training data set, then you're probably not going to generalize that well. We observe this practically, and this also is observed when you construct, say, generalization bounds. So you could basically, like a lot of the generalization bounds have this flavor of your generalization is related to or proportional to the smallness of the deviation of the test set to the training set. So in a similar sense, if you have a downstream data set that is substantially different from your training data set, this is potentially not going to perform very well. But interestingly, if you allow for certain kinds of deviation in your training data set, like maybe each of the data sets that comprise your training data set are separate classes. So like for each training data set, you see like these like a set of novel classes, and you are able to train the model on those novel classes and get some downstream performance. At test time, you could incorporate the same sort of variations. So you can potentially generalize two sorts of like existing symmetries in your training data set. So you could potentially generalize to novel classes at test time. The degree to which this like deviation is allowed is not very well theoretically understood. Practically, it seems that you can get some like interesting extrapolations, but not really, because it has to be that the sort of symmetry that you're generalizing to at test time is something that is sort of covered by the variations you observe in your training data set.
Okay, so one more question. Like in meta learning, we are trying to infer some sort of structural biases to the model from the data. And then there is another paradigm of self-supervised learning in which we do not define any specific goal for the model to learn. So I just wanted to ask, like, do you see any sort of parallel between these two paradigms, or like any comparison that you came across?
Could you describe the paradigms again? I think I missed that. Sorry, that sound.
Okay, so the first one is the meta learning that we described. We infer structural biases from the data. We were inferring theta from the data in hierarchical Bayesian modeling. And then in self-supervised learning, like the way the BERT is trained, or like other examples are curiosity-driven, some reinforcement learning problems. So we do not define a task, but eventually after the initial session, the model is able to adopt to few short problems. So with small amount of data. I mean, is there any comparison that you came across between these two?
Yeah.
Approaches?
In a sense, I think they, like, I know that there exist sort of like unsupervised or self-supervised meta-learning applications. So
okay.
People will basically use the loss function for self-supervised learning in place of the loss function that a meta-learning algorithm uses to optimize a model. So they're kind of like targeting orthogonal aspects of the learning problem. So I think it's definitely valid that you could combine these two. Mm-hmm. So basically have a like self-supervised meta-learning algorithm that is maybe able to generalize to a slightly different variation, or generalizes to a slightly different formulation of the context in self-supervised learning or context prediction. So yeah, I view them as like somewhat orthogonal.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, it might be interesting to look at, because I think like the benefit of doing meta-learning is that at test time you can deal with having very little data. So if there's an interesting context prediction or a self-supervised problem that is data limited in some sense, like maybe it's a real world application, then if you can show meta-learning helps in that scenario, I think that would be pretty interesting.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
I just cut out. 1 second, please. Sorry, could somebody say something?
Hello.
Oh no.
Hi. Can you?
Sorry, 1 second, please. Okay. I think it's actually the Zoom. Let me enter. Hi, could somebody say something?
Hi.
Hey.
Yeah. Okay, great. Sorry about that. Yeah, were there any other questions?
I think that's all. We've already answered our questions. Okay, so there is one.
Yeah. Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So what I wanted to know was like, can we use this like meta learning to train on some simpler tasks and then extrapolate it while, doing some reinforcement learning type of thing? Like, for example, on a very extreme case, like if we train the robot arm to work in a two-dimensional environment, and would it help if we just, train that on a simpler data set like a 2D environment and then used some other algorithm while making it learn in a 3D environment or even more complex space?
Yeah, in a sense, I think that if you try to treat as your training set simpler environments than you wish to generalize to, that this is not going to work, because in that case, your test environment is not really well supported by your training distribution. So it's not really doing any magic in the sense that you can't generalize to things that are substantially different to the training environments. Was that your question?
Yeah, more or less. Like
yeah, I think it's
exactly drastically different, but if a little bit more complex environment, like we train it on some simple thing and then we try to generalize it to a more complex space.
Yeah, I think that's also not really well. It's not really well supported by the theory, because you can't really generalize substantially out of distribution, because meta learning is just optimizing something like or it's performing something like empirical risk minimization. The cases in which meta learning has worked and has allowed you to do something interesting are when basically your test data set is a symmetry of your training data set. So say I have say I'm training on MNIST digits and my training data sets are specific rotations, like maybe I have one training data set, which is the vertical alignment. I have one that's like a 90-degree rotation, and then I have another that's like the 180-degree rotation. I can generalize to things that are like a 270-degree rotation of the digits, because it's sort of within the space of symmetries of what I've observed at training time. But I couldn't generalize to say from MNIST to CFAR. It's going to do any magic there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool. Maybe I can't hear, unfortunately. Could somebody else try to say something?
Can you hear us?
I rejoined again. Could somebody try to say something?
Hey.
Yeah, okay, I can hear now. Yeah.
Okay. So, do we have any more questions? I'm asking to the participants. Okay, I guess not. So I guess I'll thank you on behalf of Brain and Cognitive Society. It was a great talk. We all learned so many new things about meta learning and inductive biases. And we had some really cool questions and discussions. And thank you for giving your time to us and presenting your work here. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, it was very nice to talk with you all. I'm glad we connected and I was able to share some things with you. I think student organizations are great, and it's y'all are excited about similar things in this interface between machine learning and cognitive science. I wish I had a group like this in my undergrad that I could share interesting things with. So it's really cool what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Ishika, for organizing all of this and connecting us with you. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Ishika.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, well, have a nice evening to you all.
Yeah.
And,
okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Sometime soon. Thanks. Goodbye.
Bye.